Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Awakening Report. Boy, there's so much happening. Now, I know this is an odd time to have the show, but I have a guest from Haifa, Israel. And if we had it at the normal time, he'd be up till 3 in the morning, and that just isn't very nice for him. So I'm glad to introduce and reintroduce David Silver. I had him on the show before, and it's great to have you back, David. How are you?
Yeah, hey, shalom, Pastor Doug, and everybody who's watching or listening. Well, it's very hot here. It's summertime and busy, of course, but I'm looking forward to just sharing a little bit with the people on the show.
Absolutely. Now, you live in Haifa. That's right next door to Lebanon, as I recall in my geography. So I had the chance to go there. Beautiful, beautiful city. I mean, of all the cities in Israel, I have to admit that I think is the most beautiful as far as nature and such goes. I wouldn't live there because I start to melt when it gets too hot. But it's very pretty. Not too far from Mount Hermon, which is a very interesting place as well. And so we're going to talk about a little bit about what happened in Lebanon. We're going to talk about the fall feasts and kind of how those are a template for what we see coming in the future with the return of Yeshua, of course. But I'd love for you to give us an update on what happened from your perspective. What happened in Beirut not long ago?
Yeah, well, it was it a week ago today, I think. And just by the way, I prefer to say that I live on Mount Carmel. It sounds far more spiritual, right? And it's really the truth because actually Haifa sits on Mount Carmel. So we have uptown, midtown, and downtown. So I live fairly close to the road, and it's not a mountain, it's more like a range. It actually takes an hour, almost an hour, to drive along from the coast side across to that Elijah site, which you may have visited, some of the people may have visited, where there's a statue of Elijah and an amazing lookout over the valley of Megiddo, Armageddon. We might talk about that later if we have time. It's one of my favorite places. So I can, from my balcony high up here on the mountain, we can see the border with Lebanon. We can see Mount Hermon with snow. We can see the snow on Hermon in the wintertime when the air is clear. I can see Nazareth, the whole city of Nazareth out there on the hill. And I can just about see into the entrance of the valley of Armageddon, of Megiddo Valley. So it's an amazing vantage point. And I often tell my friends that if they stay in the good books with me, they can have pound seats for World War III, which is not far from the reality, because there's a lot going on up here. And if you look at the history of Israel, most of Israel's history, particularly the wars and conflicts, happened from Mount Carmel north. So we have a vantage point here, and of course, living where we live, and as part of our ministry as well, I keep a very close eye on what's going on. My wife kind of rebukes me all the time for listening to the news too much, but part of our ministry is communication. So I need to know what's going on so I can communicate it with others, primarily, Pastor Doug, for prayer. We're here to teach and inform, but primarily our ministry is to raise prayer for Israel. So we find ourselves in this very sensitive spot on the planet. And so just going back to the Lebanon explosion that was in the Beirut port, probably 40, 50 miles from where I live. I would have the size of the explosion, I would have expected to have heard it. We didn't. But it was probably muffled by the mountains, whereas over in Cyprus, which is about 180 miles, they heard it.
Wow.
And it was a massive explosion. They're talking about equal to the hydrogen bombs that they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I think it was fractions of the hydrogen bomb, but
no, I thought they'd said it was. But anyway, it was almost 3,000 tons of this fertilizer, and I think Timothy McVeigh used 200 tons on the federal building. Which city was that in? Anyway, Oklahoma, right?
Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma.
Yeah. Right.
So that 3,000 against 200, it's a massive amount. So some other buildings in the port caught fire. How that stuff got there, if you people aren't aware, there was a ship a cargo ship traveling from the Ukraine to delivering it somewhere, and they stopped over in the Beirut port. They didn't have any money to pay for their stop over there, and so the port seized the ship. The crew actually deserted it and ran away because they just saw the hopelessness of the situation. And so I guess they emptied out the ship, and they put all of this almost 3,000 metric tons of ammonia nitrate, which is a simple fertilizer, but it's a very, very powerful explosion when mixed with other ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
So it sat there for, I don't know, 2.5 years or so in a very unsafe environment. Some other buildings looked like they caught fire, and one of them looked like a fireworks factory. There was flashes going off, so that looked like fireworks. And ultimately, the whole place went up. I think it was most probably an unfortunate accident because of incompetence. And I mean, all of the port executive are in jail. They've been arrested. The government I think the whole government resigned yesterday. And the people in Lebanon are rioting. Even today, there's massive riots going on, quite violent. It looks the same as what's happening in Portland, actually. The people are just totally fed up with the incompetence and the corruption of the Lebanese government. But I heard CNN say, well, if they swear in a new government, it's probably likely to look not very different to the old one, because they just don't. And even the people, I think I heard the people of Lebanon are actually asking for France to take over control, because it is a French, it had been under French control. So they're even more, and it's unusual for a sovereign nation to ask someone else to come and take over, but they realize the hopelessness of their own political situation. So they see that they would be better off with with French, the French people looking after their nation. Hezbollah, which is the terror organization which is based in southern Lebanon, Sheikh Nasrallah, the leader, he's denied having weaponry there and weaponry storage. But Israel said they identified 24 Hezbollah storage sites in southern Lebanon. So I choose to believe that Israel knows what they're talking about, and Sheikh Nasrallah is not likely to be telling the truth. So anyway, I think it was an unfortunate accident. Maybe the truth will come out differently, but at this point in time, everybody's saying it's an accident, and there's been a few of these rabid anti-Semite right-wing websites blaming Israel, but they blame Israel for everything.
Right. And I think that's important that you bring that up, because I think so many times we need more time to gather the facts to really understand. And people that are jumping on this bandwagon that it's an absolute conspiracy and that it was Mossad or whatever, it's like, first of all, if Mossad had done it, they cover their tracks pretty well. Secondly, having lived in Israel, of course you live in Israel, I know that the basic heart of the Israeli people is not to kill innocents, right? They're very good at taking out specific targets, right? But it's usually like a guy or a small cluster of people that are military targets. But just a random thing that's going to kill hundreds and wound thousands, they're not into that. That is not their MO. So I really think we need to just give the news cycle and give the investigators time to look into this. And I think our prayers should be with the people. And it was an unfortunate and tragic accident based on incompetence largely. But it's unlikely that it was it was all the bad Jews or something like that. And
of course, Israel does, whether they acknowledge or not, they do live by Torah-based morality, which is to preserve lives. Colonel Richard Kemp, who was the British he was a top military commander in Afghanistan for a number of years. He said that Israel is the IDF is the most moral army in the world. And both of my sons have been soldiers. My eldest son, who's a pastor, also is a reserve. I think he's a captain now. I think he just got made a captain in the engineering corps. The other son, the youngest son, he was actually I shouldn't be divulging too much information, but he was actually a sniper and a navigator in a very high level, like the Green Berets kind of thing. But both of my boys told me that often they put their own lives in danger to save the lives of civilians that were in the way of a possible mission. So, we're human and we do make mistakes, but, the thing is, the bottom line, Pastor Doug, is that, the IDF is not the monster or the ogre that the news media paints us to be. And of course, we all need to, reflect on that Bible verse that says that, where is it? The whole 1 John 5:19. The whole world lies under the influence of the evil one. Satan was also the prince. He's the prince of the power of the air. In the spiritual realm, he controls the airwaves, and also in the natural realm, a lot of the news feeders. These are the major companies that actually feed the news to radio stations, television stations, newspapers. They all got bought up by the royal family of Saudi Arabia, who are they're Muslims. So the foundation of the news is in the hands of the other kingdom. So we need to be very, very careful.
Wow.
And one of the few times that Yeshua admonished the people around him, one of the times he said, be careful how you hear, or be careful how you see, because God knows that what goes in our eye gate or ear gate changes the way we think, and that changes the way we feel in our hearts. So we need to be very, very careful. What Yeshua was really saying, and it's part of a message I share sometimes, when in regards to what people are listening to, even what they're watching on TV, the movies they go to, even the music they listen to. And I'll say this again to everybody watching or listening, is we need to be, what Yeshua was really saying is, be very careful what you allow yourself to be exposed to. Because that's how the enemy works.
Good word. And, I was just going through the 10 Commandments with a Hebrew class I'm teaching. And we were looking at commandment number 9, right? That you should not bear false witness against your neighbor. And, of course, it's beautiful in Hebrew. But what really struck me is that, against your neighbor. Who's your neighbor? Jesus was asked, who's my neighbor, right? It was the guy that the Jews hated. It was the Samaritans. That was the neighbor that Jesus talked about. And I thought, wow, even the guy that you really hate, the group that you think are the worst on the planet, you should not slander them either. You should not bear false witness about the people that you greatly dislike either. And whether we're spreading the slander and the misinformation, or the nasty comments, or we're listening to the nasty comments, to the nasty witness, both of those are things that are not pleasing in God's sight. So I think great word.
Sure. Yeah. And just along those lines, the word of God tells us to not to rejoice when our enemy falls, and that's not easy sometimes. It's very human to want to see your enemy defeated, or suffer something. And also we're told to give your enemy a glass of water if he needs it. So that's the Lord's way, and the Lord's levels are far different to ours. So it's a hard level to reach.
And I think we fall into this us versus them mentality. This is like the oldest, bifurcation in the world, right? That, my group is the good group. Your group, they're the bad guy, right? Yeah.
And what helps me as a Jewish person, even, let go a lot of the things that the so-called church has done to the Jewish people, is really the blame for everything bad in this world. It lies at the foot of the devil. A lot of people, people are just caught up in this thing, as it says in 1 John. Most people are under the influence of the evil one. Even a lot of people that sit in churches, sadly, are listening to the wrong voice. So, we just need to let these, anything personal like that, it needs to go over our heads, because we're supposed to have died anyway, and there's no longer I that live. So, but there's a lot of offense goes on in the body of Messiah as well.
Yeah. Well, and I tell you what I find especially troubling is I find people that are Hebrew roots, Torah, Messianic, whatever you want to call them. And sometimes, no, not all of them, right? But I have found certain groups that can be sometimes the most inflammatory against the Jews. And I'm just shocked. I'm like, wait a second, I thought you were into Torah and all this stuff. And they're like, yeah, I am, but it's those darn Jews. And I'm like, wait, no, don't do that, Yeah.
And some of those groups actually find, they fall into the trap of replacement theology. They think, hey, we're the Jews, and they aren't. Even I hope I don't want to rattle anybody, but there's this Ephraimite and two house doctrine as well. But that, in its simplest forms, it's harmless. And those people, at least they love Israel. They want to be our friends. But at the extreme of that, of the Ephraimite movement, they say that the people living in Israel, like myself, are not even Jews. We are, what do they say we are? Anyway, somewhere from northern Russia.
Yeah.
And they are the real Jews, but that's just a real form. It's an extreme form of replacement theology.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because, yeah, that gets really tricky. And, I definitely have seen the two house history in the Bible. Let's just say that I see the house of Judah and the house of Israel. But I think what you're saying, and I would tend to agree with, is that some people within that Ephraimite movement tend to just replace themselves. Like they're now like, hey, we're moving in and you got to get out of here because you guys aren't even real anyway. They're like, that's not what Jesus was trying to do here, right? Paul said there's no separation. There's no wall of division. And anyway, that's a whole different discussion. But I agree. If we just have a heart of love, it would solve a lot of problems, right?
Yeah, and just going back to what we were talking about earlier about this whole conspiracy, I am actually a conspiracy person because I've been studying the end times for 30 years. So they're definitely, and I just produced I gathered all the information that I've had access to, and I put a PowerPoint together. It was just screeds and screeds of information, which really point to the fact that there is something going on with the Illuminati, the New World Order. But in my calling to be a light to the nations, and like I think you mentioned before, we need to be we need to be disseminating truth. I've actually been holding back a lot of getting into too strongly and making any statements. I'm just trying to produce or present information. But I got nicely rebuked by two brothers here in Israel, one first of all for being too conspiracy minded, and the other guy rebuked me for not being conspiracy minded enough. So it's hard to keep everybody happy, right?
I know. I've gone down that same rabbit trail, I want you to know. And it's very interesting. It definitely tickles your ears. And probably a lot of it is true, right? In fact, when I was a pre-tribber, there was this one church that kept asking me to come and give a prophecy update, right? They wanted to hear, like, come on, Doug, tell us what's happening in the world so that we're out of here next week, tomorrow. And, I kind of tell them, here's what's happening in Iran. Here's what's happening in Israel. They're like, ooh, this is exciting, right? And then I thought, they kept inviting me, like, frequently. I'm like, okay, I'm running out of information. I don't have any tantalizing stuff, So I started giving them some more of the Illuminati kind of stuff, and they never invited me back because, I think, there's a certain part of us that wants to hear, how bad the world is, and that means that I'm going to get zapped out of here any second. But when you start to really uncover the dirt, the ugliness, the depravity that Satan has created in this world, and that, yes, does exist in these various conspiracies, then it's too much. It's like, wait, I can't handle that. And I don't want to think that the world is really that bad, and which
I don't know. It's getting it is getting pretty serious out there. And, the other thing is a lot of, Christians have this propensity to try and help God out by blowing things. We don't need to do that. Just present the facts, and particularly with the COVID virus and whether masks work or don't work, and what the government's up to, and even the vaccines. I know there's a lot of particularly American Christians who obviously have been watching end time stuff and had a lot of teaching from various people, pre-tribbers mainly, for a long time. They're very, they're these anti-vaxxers, but not all vaccines are bad. And I do believe that something is going on with Bill Gates and Fauci and the World Health Organization and the CDC. But I'm not willing to make any category, any open, definitive statement, because I don't really know. But I really do smell a rat. And but that other people are just categorically saying, well, we won't take a vaccine. But there are vaccines. Israel's working on vaccines, and not all vaccines are bad. We just need to be very careful. We need to spend time studying, what's in these things, who's behind it, where it's coming from, and then I think we can move ahead with safety.
I totally agree with you, and Yeah, I think when we start making it all black or all white,
Yeah.
that's when we get in trouble. And some vaccines have been very beneficial. Some, maybe not. So,
Yeah.
good
And really,
way.
my interest in presenting facts like that, and I got it, I guess, from the guy that he mentored me in that information. He was an evangelist. So I'm basically an evangelist. So I'm using it to inspire people to get closer to the Lord, or those that aren't working with the Lord. I use that information to try and get people into the kingdom. But we don't need to exaggerate. We don't need to blow it up. Just present the facts as they are.
Mm-hmm.
I really do believe we are living in the end times. Everything that's happening around us is I believe we're moving more and more into Matthew 24, Luke 21, and beginning to move into the time of Revelation. So
kind of lay out like the big milestones that you see it. Like, how would in your opinion, when did you say, yes, we are actually in that time of Jacob's trouble, or the 70th week of Daniel, whatever terminology you like to use?
Yeah, well, I don't think we are in the 70th week.
We've arrived.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, well, the thing is, Daniel is the key to the book of Revelation, and it's amazing. You need to understand Daniel to understand the book of Revelation, and that Daniel 70th week. It's one of the most amazing prophecies. That whole chapter 9 of Daniel is absolutely amazing. In fact, the whole book of Daniel is really amazing. I just finished reading it again just a few days ago. But that 70th week is really the key. And, that 70th week is the final 7 years. So when we see that 70th week begin, when we're sure of that fact, we know we've got 7 years and a few days, that counting down to the return of the Lord. And so I believe the milestones would be a major war breaking out in the Middle East. Out of that war comes a 7-year peace treaty, and actually whoever signs that or brings that peace treaty to the table will be the Antichrist. And then for the first 3.5 years, things aren't too bad, and they build the temple. And then in the middle of the week, as it says in Daniel, or in the middle of the 7 years, the Antichrist then puts his idol up in the temple, and that's when the Jewish people, for a start, know that there's something wrong with this guy. And hopefully most born again Christians will also realize, well, they should realize even before at the beginning, that when the Antichrist does come on the scene, we should automatically know that he is not really the Messiah, he's the false Messiah. And even just going back to the virus and the fact that some people are saying that the vaccine will carry some kind of ID code, which is the mark of the beast. That mark of the beast can't come in until 3.5 years into the Daniel's final week. So it's at least 3.5 years away. And that war that I mentioned, that can literally break out. It could happen today. It might be 2 or 3 years away, but we really are, I believe, moving into that time zone.
Yeah. Well, I took a look at Matthew 24, where he talks about the parable of the fig tree.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that was like just this mind-blowing thing. I'm like, wait a second. You have, and the way I'm reading it is the fig tree that comes back is representative of both Israel, both the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
the house of Judah came back in 1948. And he says that a generation, which we know from Scripture is 70 or 80 years. We've passed the 70-year mark, so that 2018 definitely cannot be it. 2028 would seem to be the next thing, but there's another one. A generation could be 100 years per Genesis 15. So, again, I don't know when the return of Jesus is, but I do feel like we've got to be in that window. We've got to be in that place where we're in that last generation that's going to see these things happen. And that's
just the re-emergence of Israel as a nation in 1948, and also 1967, I believe, is another strategic year. Okay. And I believe that when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, the prophetic time clock stopped because the prophecies can't count down when Jerusalem's not in the hands of the Jewish people. So I believe that on, when was it, June the 10th, 1967, at the end of that amazing 6-day war that you can only describe as an absolute miracle intervention of the Lord, when Jerusalem was reunited under Jewish sovereignty for the first time in almost 2,000 years. I believe on that day, the prophetic time clock started ticking again. So we really are on that final countdown. But all of those working out, Pastor Doug, I think it can only work on the Hebrew calendar, not on the Gregorian calendar.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course that's lunar and it's shorter. So that's where the time difference lies, is in the fact that one is shorter than the other over a number of years. It adds up to some time.
Right. Fascinating. It's just great stuff. So what I love the fall feast. I mean, it was the fall feast and understanding their prophetic significance that really helped me sort of cross over into the messianic Torah perspective, because I'm like, wait, we're missing all this beautiful stuff. I want to be part of that, and it was, I did a PowerPoint years ago when I was still a pre-tribber, and I'm like, aren't these really cool? And people are like, yeah, those are neat, but then you keep looking at them, you're like, I think this really is it. And yeah, so I crossed over anyway. But the fall feast, I mean, we had the spring feasts were fulfilled to the day when Jesus came, right? Obviously, for Passover, he goes to the cross, right? He's in the tomb for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He rises again on the Feast of First Fruits. And then the Holy Spirit, I mean, this is mind-blowing. The Holy Spirit is given on the same day, Shavuot, when God gave the law back gave the law. But anyway, he talked about it back at Mount Sinai, right? And the people, it says the people observed voices, kolot, right? Which could be thunders, maybe, lapidim, which are torches, right? And those are the same things that happened on the day of Pentecost. People were hearing these voices, obviously speaking in different languages. They saw these little torches of fire on people. And I mean, it's just this incredible, do-over, shall we say. So I'm convinced absolutely that the second coming and all of those events will correspond with the fall feast. I think Jesus will be, the last trump will happen on the Feast of Trumpets. I think
I believe it
is going to happen on Yom Kippur. And then I think God will begin to dwell with his people.
Yeah.
For Sukkot. I mean, it's beautiful, right? This is so awesome.
There's something actually on the end of it that I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but I'll share it in a minute. But let's go back a little bit. You said the feasts are fulfilled on the same day. Sometimes, Pastor Doug, it's even to the minute.
Wow.
And the typology, I mean, the typology is just amazing. And I don't subscribe to Good Friday being on Friday. It can't be, because you can't have Palm Sunday and Good Friday, because that's 5 days or 6 days.
3 days in between. I know.
Because see, the whole feast cycle, and even I think it's good to even say that we call them feasts, and some people say they're Jewish feasts. They're not Jewish feasts.
Right.
God says these are my feasts. In fact, the word in Hebrew is moedim, which means, and it doesn't mean a feast. Most of them, except Yom Kippur, they become a feast because we celebrate and rejoice in the goodness of the Lord. But really, the word moedim means an appointed time. And so my wife says that, she puts it this way, that God's got he's got a very big office up in heaven, because he's got a lot of human beings like us to take care of. He's got a very large desk up there, and he's got a big diary on his desk. And in his diary, he's got 7 very special dates. Now, of course, in the new covenant, we can meet with God every day, as many times as a day that we care to take the time to do that. Of course, in the older covenant, it was only the high priest, a male from the tribe of Levi, who could go into the presence of the Lord on Yom Kippur once a year, but we can do that in every day. God has got he's got 7 days when we can meet with him in a very special way. And those are really days when God comes down to meet with his people. So it happened on the original, the original day of Shavuot. God came down the mountain, and Moses came. He called Moses up. And, as you just said, the place was shaking. There was smoke, fire, thunder, which you'd expect to be when the creator of the universe gets close. And those things were repeated on that same day about 3,000 years later, was it? On what we call the day of Pentecost. And the thing is, these feasts are you could say they're God's roadmap. Who was talking about roadmaps? Was that George Bush or Obama? But anyway, God has a roadmap, and his roadmap is laid out in these feasts. So the point of the feast is, number one, to teach our children about who God is.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, they show the faithfulness of God.
Mm-hmm.
Because just the fact that everybody, down through the last 4,000 years, there's been a number of evil dudes who've done their very best to get rid of the Jewish people, but we're still here and we're still celebrating the feast or these special days in a rebirth nation of Israel. So that just shows God's faithfulness, because he said it would happen.
Mm-hmm.
But also the feasts lay out the prophetic time clock. Now, we were talking about that before. And, there's 7 of them, 4 have been fulfilled to the minute. And even, if I don't know if you've seen this, I'm sure you have, but maybe some of the viewers haven't. What happened on the original day of Shavuot? It says 3,000 people died that day because they weren't in the right situation. What happened on the day of Pentecost? 3,000 people were born again, exactly the same number. So that, I think, God doesn't have to do that. But what I think he's doing is he's giving us little windows into the fact that these feasts really are important. So the 4 of the 7 have been fulfilled. And, if you ask a friend or somebody how I go from point A to point B, and if they gave you 7 waypoints, and if you found the first 4 waypoints exactly where your friend said they would be, you'd be feeling very confident that those last 3 would be there as well, and you would arrive at your destination. So, as you just said, Pastor Doug, we're waiting for the fulfillment of these 4 feasts. So, I also agree and believe that the feast of or the rapture must be on Yom HaTruah. The Jewish people, again, we call it Rosh Hashanah. It's totally wrong. Rosh Hashanah means the head of the year. Mm-hmm. It happens on the first day of the 7th month. So how can that be the head of the year? And God even says, I think it's Exodus 12:2, that Passover, he says, Passover is the beginning of your month. So God's very clear about that. So I don't celebrate Rosh Hashanah. If I do, I celebrate it at Passover time.
I used to be bothered by that. And then I realized that within my year, I have lots of New Years. I mean, there's the Sylvester that we celebrate in January. Yeah. And there's of course, the one in Passover. And then, we have a new year when we have a school year, right? So every fall we have a new year. So I kind of figured there's lots of New Years. We've got tax years, we've got fiscal years, we've got educational years. So,
and I do believe, actually, and the Jews said, I think it's right. I actually believe that the day that day, the Feast of Trumpets, is the day that God started to create the universe. Because, when God called Moses up Mount Sinai, it said the sound of a shofar grew louder. Well, Moses wasn't blowing a shofar, and God didn't have a horn. What I believe that shofar sounded, it's God's voice.
Yes.
God's voice is the sound of a shofar. Yes. And I don't think it's biblical, but the Jews say that when God was creating the universe, the sound of the shofar was heard through the entire void of the universe.
I can buy that totally. And think about it. When Jesus comes back, he's going to send those angels out with the voice of a trumpet, right? It's the same.
Well, no, it's not. It's the shofar of God and the voice of the archangel, I think.
Well, that's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But in Matthew 24, it says that the Son of Man will send out his angels
gather in. Yeah, sure.
The voice of a trumpet, right?
Yeah.
So it's his voice. And John saw Jesus, or should I say, heard Jesus, and then saw Jesus on the island of Patmos. His voice was a trumpet. It was a trumpeting quality, right? So it's the same trumpeting voice that we've had throughout this whole thing, right? Nothing has changed there. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Beautiful. So what that was on Mount Sinai, it was God calling Moses saying, "Come up here and meet me." Right. And on the day of the rapture, when that it says the shofar of God, I think it's God again saying, "Come up, to meet me." So anyway, I believe that day must occur on Feast of Trumpets, or it's actually the memorial of it doesn't even say the trumpets. It actually says Yom HaTruah, means the memorial of blowing. That's really simply what it says.
Okay.
Anyhow, that leads us onto Yom Kippur. And then, of course, there is the Feast of Tabernacles, which I believe is the millennium. But, I just saw this recently. There's another at the end on the 8th day of Tabernacles or Sukkot. It just says in the Bible, it says it's a holy convocation. It's a Shabbat, right? Mm-hmm. But the Jewish people call it Simchat Torah. It's not biblical, but they call it Simchat Torah, which means the joy of the Torah. And in that, there's a major lesson for most of the church, because why and you go to the synagogues, they get their Torah scrolls out, they're dancing, the men are dancing, they're rejoicing, right. And the reason why they're so happy that day is because they got to the end of the Torah reading.
Yep.
And what they do is they're happy because they roll it up to the beginning and get to start again.
Yes.
They love the Torah. They love God's instructions so much that they're just so happy that they finished it and that we can go again, right? That's what they're happy about. But the picture I see in that, and I don't know if anybody else has seen this, is what, Pastor Doug, what happens at the end of the millennium? It's like God rolls up this universe and creates a new one, right?
That's good.
Yeah,
I tend to think that the rolling up happens at a different time, but that's fine.
At the end of 1,000 years.
Yeah, I see the guys rolling up at the return of Jesus.
At the return.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Okay. So we differ on that, because I think the return of Yeshua is the beginning of the millennium, right? Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And that's when.
But that's in this present Jerusalem. Yeah. Anyhow, so we can also kind of get a fair idea of where we are in prophetic time by studying the feasts, mm-hmm. and by looking around and seeing, well, how does the situation in the world, how does that fit with what we're seeing in the picture of the festival?
Right. What do you think happens, or what has happened historically to the church by completely ignoring the feasts? How do you think the church has been a bit impoverished, or massively impoverished, by ignoring God's feasts just on a salvific, like this beautiful picture of salvation, picture of the coming of the Lord? What have we lost?
Well, in a modern current answer to that question, we've lost generations of young people who don't believe in God anymore. Because, as I said before, one of the primary reasons for the feasts, or these appointed times, is for Jewish people to teach their children about God. And of course, when you have a Passover Seder and tell the story of what happened to us, we're really teaching our children, again, the faithfulness of God. So there's so many generations now they don't believe in God anymore. They've been deceived by evolution, but that we didn't have the deep, rich teaching from the festivals, from God's plan to counteract the teaching of evolution, which kind of destroys the first few pages of Genesis and really the validity of the Bible. And generations of kids simply don't believe. They laugh when they know you're a believer. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that there's all these way out time setters have been setting dates and times for the return of the Lord for hundreds of years and still are doing it, but they're totally lost if they don't connect it to the feast cycle.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and of course, I think by rejecting the feast, then it just follows that you'd reject the Jews, right? Mm-hmm. And this, of course, happened very early on in the history of the church, sadly. But we have this big wedge that happened between the Gentile believers and the Jewish believers, and that wedge just got bigger and bigger until the Gentiles took over, and the Jews, who are they? We don't need them, right? We're done with all that stuff. We don't need, as they would say, we don't need the feasts. Those are Jewish feasts, and so they can really divorced the Hebrew scriptures, the quote unquote Old Testament, from the writings of the apostles, the New Testament, right? And so then, you have a generation upon generation of people that think, well, I only need the New Testament. I don't need that old Jewish stuff, because that was for the old school. We're into this new thing, and it's just grace, 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 grace. And God at Mount Sinai gives the biggest declaration of grace you can possibly imagine, right? He goes in front of Moses and he says, the Lord, gracious and merciful, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, right?
Yeah.
And then that is echoed throughout the ages. It's echoed in the words of King David. It's echoed in the words of Jonah the prophet, as he's like, see, Lord, I told you I didn't need to come here to Nineveh, because I know that you're a God who's gracious and merciful, right? I told you this before I come. And this is just, it's all the way through. It's in the book of Nehemiah. It's everywhere, this idea that God is gracious and merciful. And it happened when God gave the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai.
Well, actually, I started to really move into this greater understanding and appreciation of the Torah. I was watching Christian television one day here in Israel, and whoever was preaching blurted out, grace began at the cross. And I thought, hang on a minute, that's not right. Really, I know I agree with what you just said also, but I think we can go back even further, Pastor Doug. And I really believe grace began in the Garden of Eden, because when Adam and Eve listened to the wrong voice and sinned against the Lord and broke the only rule there was, God could have said, well, forget that idea. Well, let's try something else. But his grace, they were cast out of the garden, but God has had this 6,000 year, plan to redeem to redeem mankind back to himself, which, as we've been saying, we're getting pretty close to the end of the journey.
Yeah, it sure does look like it. And of course, really to your point, grace didn't ever begin, right? I mean, it was manifested when Adam and Eve blew it, but the gracious spirit has always been a part of who God is, right? That's his character. That's one of his values. That's who
it is,
right?
And we need to see the Torah as grace, because for God so loved the world that he did give his only begotten son, but he also gave us his instruction manual. Right. His book of instructions. I'm trying to move people away from calling it the law, because the word Torah doesn't mean law. And I think human beings have a propensity to put up a shield when we're told what to do. It's just sadly our rebellious nature. But Torah really means instructions. It comes from another word, yara, which is like the bullseye of a target. So really the Torah is God's goal for our lives. And if it's the Creator's goal for our lives, it should be our goal for our lives as well. And, it doesn't really make sense to say, well, I worship you, you're my Creator, you're my Father in heaven, but then refuse to follow his gracious instructions. It's not rational.
I know. I've been round and round with people on this topic, and I hear you. No matter how many times you try to show them, look, God's laws are, laws, commandments, whatever, are good. God gave us these. They're like, no, that's the law of Moses, and we don't have to do that. I'm like, what are you talking about, right? But, after a while, you're just like, okay, you go your way, I'm going my way. We've talked about this long enough, and I don't know what to tell you. But there's a fundamental misunderstanding. I believe one of the big culprits was a guy named Marcion.
I know.
Second century. He gave his terms like Old Testament, New Testament. He was rabidly anti-Semitic, rabidly anti-Sabbath, anti-Torah. He spoke against the Jews. All that stuff is Jewish. We don't have to do that. He really posed God of the Old Testament as this demiurge who kind of took this big burden called the law, and he put it on the backs of the Jews and said, here, take that. And then Jesus came along and freed people, including the Jews, from the law. Wow, thank you, Lord. Right? I mean, that's the basic image. And so this image, though people have no clue that this is really what they're doing, when they talk about Jesus came to free us from the Torah, when they say that grace began at the cross, that is Marcionism. All of these things are Marcionism, though most people have probably never heard of Marcion, but that's the theology. And it blew my mind when I realized that Marcionism is being taught big time at Dallas Theological Seminary.
Wow, really?
Dispensational model. Well, the dispensational model is Marcionistic at its core. and even, the whole idea of the pre-trib rapture, that the church gets taken out of here while the Jews got to stay back here and get kicked around a bit. I'm like, that's Marcionistic. It's so incredibly Marcionistic, and yet it's one of these things that we can't see. And I think that is one of the big reasons this Marcionism, this Marcion spirit, that people, by and large, have no interest in keeping God's feasts.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the enemy's strategy, to keep us ignorant, to keep us out of blessings, to keep us, again, ignorant on what's really happening on this bigger timeline that we've been talking about, that we can see it once we start keeping the feast. You're like, oh, hello. These become really clear when you start keeping the feast.
Yeah. Well, sadly, most of the men who most of the church call the church fathers are really, they were all anti-Semites, and they were all, thinking Greek and thinking Greek philosophy in many ways. And I think the root of the problem, Pastor Doug, is that the Greeks did have gods, but the Greek gods were often cruel and vindictive gods. So when they were introduced to the God of Israel, they just thought, well, here's another God, but they didn't have the revelation that he's our loving Father. He's a loving God that really cares about us. And so, they didn't want to do what he was telling them to do. So therein lies the problem. And sadly, the church has been deceived by 1900 years, and still that basic teaching is still in the church. And one of the primary methods of Bible interpretation is called Bible hermeneutics.
Yes.
Well, that word is based on the word hermeneutics comes from the Greek god Hermes.
Yes.
So here's the church trying to read a very Hebraic book, trying to discover the truth about the God of Israel with Greek glasses on. It's not possible. That's the devil's very clever. That's how he managed to deceive. So my thing at the moment is really trying to help the church throw away in fact, God gave me a message. Well, I was just preparing to speak in a meeting in South Africa 2 or 3 years back, and I was praying. I said, Lord, what do you want me to teach on here tonight? And I heard the Holy Spirit say, I want you to be my optician. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, you need to help the church change the way she sees, change the glasses. So, and then I said, okay, well, Father, can you give me a few more tips on that? And so I believe we need to change the way we see God. We need to change the way we see Yeshua. We need to change the way we see the church. Yeah. Right? Because the church is not a standalone organization. The true church is grafted into the olive tree. We need to change the way we see the nation of Israel, because Israel is not an occupying power. Right. We're one of the most benevolent nations in the world. Yes. And ultimately, the fifth one, which was the one that that the Lord really wanted me to talk about, was we need to change the way we see the Torah. Yes. Because the Torah is not the law. The Torah is a set of instructions from a loving Father to his children. Amen. Man, I'm giving you some amens on that one. Preach, brother. Yes, I know. Can I just share something else that's related to all of this? That I'm doing my own Zoom meetings. It's a Q&A forum. I let people come in and we all just chat and do like what we're doing, but it's open for anybody. But while I've been doing those, I've been seeing new things myself. So I'm not sure if I told you last time, but I wrote a book several years ago called A Slow Train Coming, and it's based on a railway map. And so it starts off in the Garden of Eden and ends up with the coming of the Lord, with everything that happens in between. But just over the last 2 or 3 weeks, the Lord showed me that the concept's right, but the map is wrong. It's not a line. It's not a linear journey. It's a circular journey, because God's in this process of restoration. He's restoring Israel to the land and to faith and to our apostolic and prophetic calling to the nations. He's trying to restore the church back to the way it was at the beginning. But really, Pastor Doug and everybody that's listening, I believe what God is ultimately wanting to do, he is wanting to restore the human race to himself. And actually, the train journey starts in the garden, and it's not a longitudinal journey, it's a circular journey. This train is heading back to the garden. Remember, there was a song, or was it Crosby, Still? I don't know. It was somebody in the 60s. They sang the song, "We Got to Get Back to the Garden." I think it came out of Woodstock. Actually, I think it was called Woodstock.
Okay.
So that's from 67, 68. And that song says, we got to get back to the garden. I believe that's where this train, now the slow train, which is not a slow train anymore, it's the bullet train, and it's on its way back to the garden. But God, and what the Lord also showed me just a couple of weeks ago, there's a shadow train. There's a shadow train. It's a false train, and there are many people going to church, and the Jewish people, they're not on the right train. They're on the wrong train. And there's a whole bunch of human beings aren't even on the train at all. They're somewhere. They're just floating around,
right?
in woo land. And you know what? Going back to my evangelism, we need to. Those of us that are on the right train, we need to be reaching out and grabbing as many people as we can off that shadow train and getting them on the right train, because the right train's on its way to the garden, and the shadow train's on its way to the abyss.
Wow.
And a lot of our family and our friends, they're heading towards the abyss. And it's speeding at breakneck speed.
Wow.
And accelerating.
I love the word, because, you know, Gan Eden is the term for paradise, right? And really, when a Jew thinks about the afterlife, they think about Gan Eden. Whereas the average Christian thinks about streets of gold and their mansion and their Cadillac in heaven and all this stuff, you know, and that heaven is very detached from the age to come in the typical Christian theology of heaven, the afterlife, right? And, you know, I've been teaching on this, of course, so I'm a little invested in this, but, you know, the book of Revelation is talking about the new Jerusalem coming down to planet Earth, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's this beautiful city, and it's got streets of gold and all that stuff. But it's an occupant on planet Earth, right? That's the important part to understand, is that God is going to restore, heal this planet so that we will live on this planet. And that's not a curse. That's not like a second class. That's really good, right?
Sure.
We'll get to go into the new Jerusalem when we want to, but we will be on this beautiful, beautiful earth that God has created without any sin, without any degeneration. That's what is so exciting. And that's part of the mentality that you're talking about.
That other concept, it's a Greek concept of us going up to heaven, because the Greek gods hang up in heaven, but our God, you know, he came down in the tabernacle. Our God likes to come down and dwell with us. And, you know, he came down, the Father came down, the Spirit of the Lord came down when the Israelites were in the desert and dwelt in the tabernacle for a long time. And, you know, Yeshua came down and dwelt amongst us. The Word became flesh, and Yeshua's coming back to tabernacle. God loves the tabernacle, and that's what that Feast of Tabernacles was all about, is remembering when God tabernacled with us, because Yeshua is coming back to tabernacle for 1,000 years, and then we're all going to be tabernacling with God, those of us that are on the right train, for eternity, but on the earth, not up in heaven. That's a very Greek idea.
That's so true. That is so true. The gods are up on that particular mountain, but they'll never come and say hello to us, lowly, us little mortals. And that's not what God wants. He wants to be with us. There is a little sin problem that he's working on, but you know, once that is completely resolved, then we're back together. We're a happy family.
Sure.
I mean,
there is a spiritual kingdom that's somewhere out there, but you know, there is a physical kingdom. When God created the universe, he produced the physical universe out of the spiritual. So he wants to have a kingdom here, a physical kingdom, so that, you know, when eternity comes, the new Jerusalem, it's coming down back to the same place where current Jerusalem is, which is again why there's such a conflict between the kingdoms.
Yes. Well, in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, right, it has that dual ending, right? So this is the idea that the rabbis have long held, even the Apostle Paul held this as well, that there's a Jerusalem above, the mother of us all, which is free, and the Jerusalem below, which is in slavery until now. You know, and so he's contrasting the spiritual heavenly Jerusalem where God, you know, dwells currently, and then the earthly one that you can get on a plane and go visit, or in a car, in your case, and go visit that place, right? So, but they both occupy the same geographic place, but they're separated in this dimensionality. There's a difference between the two.
And there's something else cool in the name Jerusalem, because Yerushalayim, Shalayim is the plural of shalom, so it's the plural of peace, and Yeru is you plural future, you will see. Yeru is to see. So what the name is really saying, and names in the Bible are all very important and indicative. So what I believe it's really saying is the name Jerusalem is saying you shall see peace twice. Well, one of Yeshua's names is Prince of Peace, and really, peace will only come when he comes back. So really, I think there's an indicator in the name that we will, we've seen him once. He came once 2,000 years ago, but we're going to see him a second time, and he's coming back soon. So that's all tied up and locked up in the name Yerushalayim.
Beautiful. Well, we're out of time.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to that second piece. That will be fantastic. How can people get a hold of you and your ministry? Where can they find your stuff?
Yeah, I've just actually, my son has just built me a new website. It's not totally finished, but it's looking pretty good. So my web address is david@outofzion.org. It's Out of Zion all jammed together, so they can see the name Out of Zion Ministry.
Outofzion.org.
Yep.
Okay.
And I send out a weekly news update with a personal teaching or something at the beginning of it. I think they can subscribe to that on this new website if it's all working right. We're doing, as I said, I'm doing a Q&A every Tuesday for North America. It's 2 p.m. I think Eastern. 2 p.m. Eastern. 2 p.m. Eastern. Yeah, 2 p.m. Eastern. I think it's 2 p.m. Eastern. And anybody's welcome to come in and have a it's a Zoom, so they can come in and ask questions or let their thoughts be known, and we can have a little bit of a brother and sisterly argument if we need to.
Very Jewish, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, often, it says iron sharpens iron, and sometimes we learn things when we listen to other people and let other people.
That is true. I agree with you. Well, thank you for sharing your insights. I just want to ask people, as I'm going to pray for Out of Zion Ministries. I really appreciate what you're doing, David, over there in Israel. The Israeli people are, by and large, wonderful people, and we want them to know the truth of the Mashiach.
Amen.
And I think a fellow Jew sharing that good news is great. I think it may be a little easier to listen to. So thank you again for all that you're doing. So I hope you get some sleep tonight, and just God bless everyone. Stay in the Word.
Thank you, and shalom.